Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. The snow came down in thick, suffocating sheets. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white as he struggled to keep the car on the barely visible road. The wipers fought against the accumulating ice, barely clearing enough of the windshield for him to see. The headlights illuminated only a wall of swirling white, giving the illusion that they were moving through an endless void. "This is bad," Sasha muttered from the passenger seat, rubbing her arms for warmth. "We should have stayed on the main road." "We would have never made it," Mark countered, his jaw tight. The highway was already blocked. This was our only option. From the back seat, David let out a low groan. "Great. So instead of waiting it out in a gas station, we're driving straight into the belly of the storm." Mark didn't reply. He couldn't, because he wasn't sure if they had made the right choice either. The GPS had insisted that this back road would reconnect with the highway after 20 miles. That had been an hour ago. The road signs were buried in snow. There was no sign of civilization. No cabins. No gas stations. Nothing. Just white. Endless, suffocating white. The engine sputtered as the tires skidded against the icy road. Mark gritted his teeth, adjusting his grip, but the car barely responded. They were losing traction. Then, a shape appeared in the distance. Mark's breath hitched. His eyes strained to focus through the storm. At first, it was nothing more than a dark blot against the endless snow, but as they drew closer, the outline became clearer. A cabin. "Look," Sasha pointed, sitting up straighter. "A house." Mark didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, guiding the car toward the structure. The tires slid dangerously, but somehow, he managed to ease the vehicle into what looked like a snow-covered driveway. The cabin was old, its wooden exterior weathered and dark. Snow piled against the walls, and the windows were completely frosted over. There were no lights, no signs of movement. "This place looks abandoned," David murmured, leaning forward to get a better look. "Doesn't matter," Mark said quickly. "It's shelter. We need to get inside before we freeze." The wind howled around them as they stepped out of the car. The cold was brutal, slicing through their clothes like knives. Sasha hunched into herself, shielding her face from the icy assault. Mark stomped through the snow, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he made his way up the creaking wooden steps of the porch. The door loomed before him, slightly ajar. A chill crawled down his spine. Had someone left it open? "Guys!" Sasha's voice was barely audible over the wind. "I don't think we're alone." Mark hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he reached out and pushed the door open. The cabin was dark inside, but not as cold as outside. The air was stale, heavy. As his eyes adjusted, he noticed something strange. The fireplace. It was still warm. Someone had been here. Recently. And they might still be inside. The warmth from the fireplace should have been comforting. It wasn't. Mark stepped inside first, his breath visible in the dim air. His boots thudded softly against the wooden floor as he took slow, careful steps into the cabin. The faint glow of the embers in the fireplace cast flickering shadows along the walls, making the place feel alive. Sasha hesitated at the door. "Something's not right," she murmured, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. David brushed past her, stomping his feet to shake off the snow. "Not right as being stuck in that storm. This is a godsend." He kicked at the old rug near the door, his voice light but forced. Bit of a fixer-upper, though. Mark barely heard him. His focus was on the room, the small details that didn't add up. The fireplace was warm, but the cabin was still covered in dust. A thick layer coated the wooden table, the shelves, the counter near the small kitchen. But the chairs had been moved. One was slightly pulled out, like someone had been sitting there recently. The floor near the hearth was bare, as if someone had stood there warming their hands. And then there was the smell. Not rotten, not moldy, just stale, like something had been shut away for too long, like the air itself had forgotten how to move. Sasha shivered. "We shouldn't be here." Mark turned to her, about to reassure her, when he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The door. The door that had been slightly ajar when they arrived was now closed. "Did one of you shut the door?" His voice was low, careful. David glanced up from where he was rummaging through a dusty cabinet. "Huh, no, I thought you did." Sasha slowly shook her head. "I didn't touch it." A heavy silence settled between them. Then, a creak from the ceiling above. Sasha's hand shot to Mark's sleeve, her fingers like ice. David froze, his eyes darting upward. The three of them stood completely still, listening. Another creak. Slower this time. A footstep. Mark's throat tightened. They weren't alone. His mind raced. Had someone been hiding up there this whole time? Watching them? Or had they just arrived? Had they been waiting? David exhaled sharply. "Okay, screw this." He grabbed a fire poker from beside the hearth, holding it like a weapon. "Whoever's up there better come down, or I swear to God." Creak. This time, the sound was directly above them. Mark felt Sasha's nails dig into his arm. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. He could feel it now, the weight of something above them. Watching, listening, David made the first move. He stormed toward the narrow staircase in the corner of the room, his grip tightening around the fire poker. "Come on," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Let's see who's been creeping around." Mark hesitated before following. Sasha stayed frozen in place, her wide eyes flicking between them and the ceiling. "Don't," she whispered. "Please, let's just leave." David ignored her. He set his foot on the first step, testing it carefully before ascending. Mark followed close behind, each step groaning under their weight. The air grew heavier the higher they climbed, thick with something unseen. They reached the top. The second floor was small. A single hallway stretched out before them, leading to two closed doors. The dust here was undisturbed, except for a trail of footprints. Bare footprints, leading from one door to the other. David inhaled sharply. What the hell? Mark followed the prints with his eyes. They stopped in front of the door on the right, then disappeared. No return path. No way out. Whoever had been up here had either vanished or was still inside. Mark's stomach twisted. He didn't want to open that door. Didn't want to know what was waiting. David squared his shoulders, reaching for the doorknob. Then, the sound of shuffling footsteps. From the other room, Mark's breath hitched. His eyes darted to the second door, the one with no footprints leading to it. And yet, something was inside. Mark's pulse hammered against his ribs. The silence in the hallway stretched too long, pressing against his skin like something tangible. Something was inside that room. David gripped the fire poker tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind rattling the cabin walls. Mark nodded, his mouth dry. The footprints had led to the other door, but the sound had come from this one. A slow creak echoed through the hallway as Sasha climbed the stairs behind them, her breathing uneven. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Right now." David shook his head. "And walk back into that storm? No way. We need to know what is in here." Mark hesitated. Every part of him screamed that this was a bad idea. The cabin was old, abandoned, and yet they weren't alone. His fingers twitched toward the doorknob. The metal was ice cold under his touch. He swallowed hard, then twisted it slowly. The door creaked open. Darkness. The room beyond was completely pitch black. Mark squinted, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The wind outside howled louder, as if protesting what they were about to do. Then, a shuffling sound. A low, slow movement. Something shifting in the dark. Mark's throat tightened. He took a hesitant step forward, barely crossing the threshold. The wooden floor groaned beneath his weight. David exhaled sharply, lifting the fire poker higher. "Who's there?" No answer. The room smelled wrong. Damp. Old. But beneath that, something else, something metallic. Mark's fingers searched blindly along the wall until they found a light switch. He hesitated. Then he flicked it on. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a dim, flickering light filled the room, casting weak, uneven shadows against the walls. And Mark saw the chair. A single wooden chair sat in the center of the room. And on it, a pile of clothes, folded neatly. Too neatly. The air left Mark's lungs in a sharp exhale. His eyes darted around the room, nothing else. No furniture. No footprints in the dust. Just that chair. And yet, someone had been sitting there. David took a step inside. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Who the hell leaves a setup like this?" Sasha lingered in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. We shouldn't be here. Mark took another step closer. The air around the chair felt thicker, heavier, like he was pushing against something unseen. The old wooden seat was worn down, splintered along the edges, yet the clothes, they were clean. David reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingers over the fabric. "It's still warm," he muttered. "Like someone just..." Then the light flickered. Once. Twice. Then died. Darkness swallowed the room. Sasha gasped, stepping backward. "Mark!" Before she could finish, a sharp breath filled the silence. Not theirs. Something else was breathing. Right next to them. The air grew colder. The wooden floor groaned again, but this time, none of them had moved. Mark's fingers dug into his palms as the weight of the dark pressed against him. Something was here. David moved first, yanking his phone from his pocket and switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, shaking slightly as he aimed it toward the chair. It was empty. The clothes were gone. Mark's stomach twisted violently. No, they had been there seconds ago. Sasha whimpered. "We need to go. Right now." David exhaled sharply, nodding. Yeah, let's get the hell out of here." Mark turned to follow them. Then he saw it. The closet door. It had been closed when they entered. Now it was open. Just a crack. A sliver of darkness stretched from the gap, thick and endless. The air inside seemed different, heavier than the rest of the room, as if the space beyond the door was deeper, larger than it should be. And from inside that darkness, a hand slid out, pale, too long, fingers that curled slowly, unnaturally, as if testing the air. Mark's breath hitched. His legs refused to move. Then, the fingers twitched, and the door began to open wider. Mark's body refused to move. The hand that had crept out from the closet was still there, fingers flexing slowly, testing the air as if it could feel them standing just outside its reach. The door creaked wider. Sasha made a soft, choked noise, pressing herself against the wall. David's grip on the fire poker was so tight his knuckles had turned white, his flashlight beam trembling as he tried to hold it steady. Mark wanted to run. He needed to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. The thing in the closet moved, not like a person stepping forward, but like something unfolding. A limb, too long and too thin, stretched out from the shadows. The fingers twitched again, reaching toward the floor. The light from David's flashlight flickered as he adjusted his grip, and for the first time, the glow illuminated something beyond the door. Mark's breath hitched. There was no back to the closet. Where there should have been a wall, there was only darkness. Endless, stretching, suffocating darkness. The space inside the closet was too deep, too unnatural. It wasn't a storage space. It was an opening, a doorway to somewhere else. And something was crawling out. David took a step back, his breath quick and shallow. What the hell? The fingers dug into the wooden floor. Sasha screamed. The thing lurched forward. Mark didn't see the rest. He was already running. He grabbed Sasha's arm, yanking her toward the hallway. David was right behind them, the fire poker clattering to the floor as he bolted for the stairs. The sound of scraping followed them, something heavy and unnatural moving across the wooden boards. They hit the first floor in a blind panic. The warm glow of the embers in the fireplace barely touched the suffocating dark that now filled the cabin, stretching from the top of the stairs like a presence. Mark fumbled for the door handle. His hands were slick with sweat, shaking uncontrollably. Locked. No. He twisted the knob desperately, yanking at it with everything he had. It wouldn't budge. Behind him, Sasha was sobbing, her hands pressed against her mouth to muffle her whimpers. David was spinning in circles, his flashlight beam swinging wildly around the cabin. Then, the creaking started again. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. Not hurried, not panicked. Slow, purposeful, coming for them. Mark slammed his fist against the door. Let us out. A soft sound reached them over the wind howling outside. Laughter. Mark's breath stopped. It was coming from upstairs. Sasha whimpered. David was whispering something under his breath, but Mark couldn't hear him over the blood roaring in his ears. Then, a knock. Not from behind them, from outside. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks against the cabin door. Mark froze. His stomach turned to ice. Sasha shook her head violently. No, she whispered. No, don't open it. David backed away from the door. What if it's someone? Then they heard it. A voice. Muffled. Distorted by the storm. But familiar. Mark's own voice. "Let me in." The color drained from his face. Sasha clamped her hands over her ears, shaking violently. David stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grip and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The knocking came again. Harder. More urgent. Mark could barely breathe. He turned toward the window, squinting through the frost-covered glass. And there, standing in the snow, just beyond the porch, was himself. The other Mark stood motionless, barely visible through the storm. The wind howled around him, but he didn't move, didn't shiver, didn't blink. Then, he smiled. The fire behind them died. The cabin was plunged into darkness. And the last thing Mark heard before the world went completely black was the sound of the door unlocking. The door swung open. A blast of icy wind tore through the cabin, snuffing out the remaining embers in the fireplace. The darkness swallowed them whole. Mark's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He couldn't see. Sasha screamed. David cursed, fumbling in the dark. His flashlight rolled across the floor, its weak beam spinning wildly before settling against the far wall. Barely enough light to see. Mark turned toward the open doorway, his body trembling. He was still there. The other Mark, standing in the snow, just beyond the threshold. His face was still twisted into that unsettling smile, his dark eyes locked onto Mark's. Then, he stepped forward. Mark staggered back, instinct screaming at him to run. David grabbed his arm. "What the hell is that?" Mark couldn't answer. He didn't know. The thing that wore his face moved like it wasn't used to having a body. Its limbs stretched too smoothly, its joints bending at angles that felt wrong. Its steps were slow, deliberate. Testing. Then it spoke. "Let me in." Mark's own voice. Flat. Hollow. Like something had heard him speak once and was trying to mimic it. Sasha was sobbing now, her back pressed against the far wall. "Close it," she choked out. "Close the door." Mark's hands trembled as he reached for the handle, but the thing moved faster. One moment it was standing in the snow. The next it was inside. Mark barely had time to react before it was inches from his face. The smell hit him first. Not the cold, not the damp, something rotten, something that had been dead for a long time. The thing tilted its head, its mouth stretching wider. "Mark," it whispered, voice glitching slightly like a corrupted audio file. "Mark, Mark, Mark." David snapped. He lunged forward with the fire poker, swinging wildly. The metal went straight through it, like it wasn't even there. David stumbled back, his face pale. What the hell?" The thing grinned. Then, it shifted. Its face rippled. Mark watched in horror as the features twisted, melted, and became David's. Sasha let out a strangled gasp. "No, no, no, no." David's own face stared back at him. The exact same eyes. The same nose. But the smile was all wrong. "David," it whispered. David fell backward, shaking his head violently. "No, no, that's not." The thing's mouth twitched. Then it lunged. Mark didn't think. He just moved. He grabbed Sasha and yanked her toward the open door. "Run!" David scrambled to his feet, his breathing ragged. They didn't look back. They ran into the storm. The cold was instant. The moment they hit the snow, the wind slammed into them with brutal force, cutting through their clothes like knives. Mark's lungs burned as he fought against the blizzard, barely able to see a foot in front of him. David was behind them, panting, swearing under his breath. Sasha clung to Mark's sleeve, half blind, her face streaked with tears. The cabin, asterisk asterisk, the cursed place they should have never entered. Asterisk asterisk was disappearing behind them, swallowed by the snow. But the thing inside it wasn't letting them go. The wind carried a sound. A whisper. Not one voice. Many. Mark didn't look back. He knew what he'd see. Shadows. Moving through the snow. Not running. Not struggling against the storm. Gliding. Following them. They weren't going to make it. Mark's legs were numb, his fingers stiff and useless. The cold was too much. Then, a light. Faint. Flickering. But real. David saw it too. "There!" he yelled over the wind. "Go! Go!" They pushed forward. The light grew closer. A building. Another cabin? No. A gas station. They stumbled toward it, feet barely carrying them, lungs on fire. Mark slammed his shoulder against the glass door, shoving it open. The warmth inside hit them like a wave. They collapsed onto the floor, panting, trembling. Safe. For now. The clerk behind the counter stared at them, wide-eyed. Jesus, you guys look like hell, he muttered, setting down his newspaper. You out in that storm? Mark couldn't speak. David nodded weakly. Came from a cabin. Up in the woods. The clerk frowned. Cabin? Sasha let out a shaky breath. Yeah, she whispered. It was abandoned, but... She hesitated. How could she explain? How could she tell this stranger what had really happened? The clerk's expression shifted. Something dark flickered behind his eyes. There's no cabin up there. Mark's stomach twisted. What? The clerk leaned forward, lowering his voice. There hasn't been a cabin in those woods for years. Sasha paled. That's not possible. The man shook his head. It burned down. Decades ago. Some hikers got caught in a storm, tried to take shelter there. He exhaled, shaking his head. They never made it out. Mark's pulse stopped. The air in the gas station suddenly felt too warm. Too thick. David swallowed hard. You're saying it's gone? The clerk nodded. Yeah. Then, a new sound. A phone notification. Mark's blood turned to ice. Slowly, mechanically, he pulled out his phone. A Snapchat message. From an unknown user. His fingers trembled as he opened it. It was a picture. Of the gas station. Taken from outside. Mark's hands trembled as he stared at his phone's screen. A Snapchat message. From an unknown user. The picture loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, but he already knew what it was before it fully appeared. The gas station. Taken from outside. The blood in his veins turned to ice. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as he forced himself to look up. The large glass windows at the front of the gas station reflected only the fluorescent glow of the overhead lights. But the storm outside was too thick to see beyond the parking lot. Mark swallowed hard and turned his phone around, showing Sasha and David the screen. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The terror in their eyes matched his own. The clerk behind the counter was watching them now, his expression unreadable. Everything okay? Mark's voice felt like sandpaper in his throat. Did anyone else come in here before us? The man frowned. No, just you three. Mark's fingers tightened around his phone. Are you sure? The clerk exhaled slowly, tossing his newspaper onto the counter. Look, kid, I know that storm's messing with your head, but trust me, nobody's been out there. BZZT. Mark nearly dropped his phone as another Snapchat notification came through. A new video. His fingers hovered over the screen, every nerve in his body screaming not to open it. He tapped it anyway. The footage started with a sharp burst of static. The camera was shaking, moving through the snow. It wasn't a recording of them inside the gas station. It was filmed from outside. Mark's breath hitched. The camera moved forward, creeping toward the large windows, the dim light from inside glowing softly against the glass. The angle shifted. The camera was watching them. Then, a shape moved past the frame. Something tall. Something wrong. The figure stopped just outside the reach of the gas station lights. The image was too grainy to make out a face, but Mark could see limbs that were too long, fingers that twitched unnaturally. Then, the figure grinned, and just before the video ended, the screen glitched, distorting the footage into eerie streaks of black and white. For a fraction of a second, just before the camera cut to darkness, the face became clear. It was Mark's. His stomach twisted violently. He dropped the phone onto the counter like it had burned him, his entire body breaking out into a cold sweat. Sasha covered her mouth with both hands. That's not real, she whispered, shaking her head. It's some kind of glitch. David picked up the phone, replaying the last few seconds. His hands were shaking as he set it back down. That wasn't a glitch. Mark couldn't speak. He couldn't move. His mind was racing, every part of him rejecting what he had just seen. Then, the lights flickered. The clerk groaned. Damn storm's messing with the power again, he muttered, grabbing a flashlight from under the counter. BZZT. Another photo. Mark didn't want to open it. He already knew what it was. Slowly, with numb fingers, he tapped the screen. The image showed the inside of the gas station. It was a picture of them, standing exactly where they were now. But there was a difference. There was a fourth person in the picture, standing right behind Mark. His stomach lurched. His hands turned to ice. He couldn't move. David sucked in a sharp breath. Sasha whimpered. Then, the power cut out. The gas station was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the howl of the storm outside and the faint hum of the generator struggling to keep up. Then, a sound. Soft. Faint. Breathing. Right behind them. The power was gone. The gas station was a tomb of darkness. Mark couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The photo still burned into his retinas, the impossible image of someone, something, standing behind him. And now, it was breathing down his neck. Sasha whimpered in the darkness. David cursed under his breath, fumbling for his phone, his voice barely a whisper. Where the hell is the flashlight? A shuffle. Not from them. From behind. Mark's body locked up. He couldn't turn around. He couldn't. Every primal instinct screamed that if he looked, if he acknowledged it, it would be real. The clerk's voice cut through the dark. All right, hold on, he grumbled, a faint click following his words. A flashlight flickered to life. The beam swept across the store, casting long, eerie shadows along the shelves. Mark's heart pounded as the light passed over them and landed on the front door. The glass was fogged over from the inside, like someone had been standing there, watching. Then, a single, smeared handprint appeared on the glass. Mark choked on air. Sasha let out a strangled cry. David took a step back, nearly knocking over a shelf. No. The handprint dragged downward. Slow, deliberate, like something was pressing its face against the glass. The flashlight flickered. Mark's mind screamed. Then, the handprint disappeared. The storm howled outside, rattling the building, but Mark could still hear it. A soft tapping against the window. Knuckles. Fingernails. Tap. 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 A rhythm, like a child asking to be let inside. The clerk swore under his breath. What the hell is going on? He stepped forward, shining the flashlight at the door. Hey, store's closed. Who's out there? David grabbed his arm, his voice shaking. Don't. Open. The door. The clerk frowned. What? You kids messing with me or some tea? Bang. A hand slammed against the glass. Not from the outside. From inside the store. Sasha screamed. Mark's vision blurred. He turned his head, just for a second, and he saw it. A figure in the aisle. It stood at the end of the row, half hidden in shadow. Tall. Still. Watching them. The flashlight beam shook violently as the clerk swung it toward the shelves. But the figure was gone. Then the whisper came. Soft. Right against Mark's ear. You brought me here. Mark's lungs collapsed. He stumbled backward, his hands gripping the counter for support. The shadows in the gas station were shifting. Stretching. The power flickered. A brief moment of light. And Mark saw them. Figures. Standing in the aisles. Lurking between the shelves. Motionless. Too many. The clerk's flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed them again. Then, the sound of footsteps. Moving toward them. Mark didn't think. He ran. David grabbed Sasha's hand, dragging her toward the emergency exit. The clerk swore, fumbling for the backup generator. Mark hit the door at full speed, shoving against it with his shoulder. It didn't budge. David slammed his fists against the metal. No. Mark turned back toward the store. The figures had moved closer. The nearest one stood just feet away, still grinning. Then the lights flashed back on, and the store was empty. No figures. No shadows. Nothing. Sasha sobbed against the door, her hands still shaking. David was pale, his breath ragged. The clerk stood in stunned silence, his face bloodless. Then, BZZZT. A new Snapchat message. Mark barely had the strength to lift his phone. He already knew what it would be. A photo. Of them. Standing exactly as they were now. But there was one difference. The door behind them was open. And in the doorway, something was waiting. Mark's blood turned to ice. The Snapchat photo showed exactly what he feared. The emergency exit behind them was open, and something was standing in the doorway. A shape barely visible in the dim lighting. Tall, too tall. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its grin, that awful stretched grin, was the only feature clear in the photo. Then, a gust of wind hit the back of his neck. Mark's stomach dropped. The door was actually open. Sasha gasped, spinning around. David cursed under his breath. The clerk, still shaking, grabbed a bat from behind the counter. The door creaked. Slowly. Wider. A heavy silence settled over them. Mark could hear nothing but the sound of his own breath, short and unsteady. Then the lights flickered again. For a moment, darkness. Then, the lights returned, and the thing in the doorway was closer. Sasha let out a choked sob. David gripped his phone like it was a lifeline, his body shaking. The clerk whispered, "What the hell is that?" Mark couldn't answer, because he recognized it. It was him, or at least something that wore his face. The same eyes, the same jawline, but the skin was wrong, like something had stretched it over a frame that wasn't human. The thing in the doorway took a step forward, and all the air in the room changed. The temperature dropped. The light dimmed. Mark's muscles locked. He couldn't move. The figure took another step, its head twitching, its body glitching in and out of focus. Then it spoke. "Let's switch." Mark's breath hitched. His chest tightened. The words were spoken in his own voice. But not quite right. Distorted. Wrong. David moved first. He grabbed a can from the nearest shelf and hurled it at the figure. The thing didn't react. The can went straight through it. David staggered back. That's not possible. The thing's grin widened. Then, it charged. Mark snapped out of his trance. "Run!" Sasha screamed, grabbing onto Mark's arm as they bolted toward the front door. David shoved past a shelf, nearly knocking it over. The clerk scrambled behind the counter, frantically hitting buttons on the register. Why? Why was he doing that? What did he think that would? BZZZT. Another Snapchat message. Mark didn't want to look. He didn't want to. But his phone screen lit up. Another photo. His heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of the front door. Boarded shut. From the outside, Mark skidded to a stop, nearly crashing into the glass. The exit was gone. The boards had appeared as if they had always been there. As if the door had never been an option to begin with. Sasha sobbed. David pounded against the glass. Nothing. The thing was getting closer. Mark turned just in time to see the clerk finally press something under the counter. A trap door. It opened with a loud mechanical click. "G.O.!" the clerk shouted, his face pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Now!" Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sasha and David and dove into the darkness below. The trap door slammed shut above them. And just before it did, Mark swore he heard his own voice whisper from above. "You can't run forever." The darkness swallowed them whole. Mark hit the ground hard, his breath knocked from his lungs. Sasha tumbled beside him, gasping. David landed with a dull thud, groaning as he pushed himself up. Above them, the trapdoor slammed shut. Then silence. The three of them sat frozen in the pitch-black space, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling from cold and fear. The air down here was thick, stale, wrong. Sasha whispered first. "Where are we?" Mark fumbled for his phone, his fingers numb and stiff. The dim glow of the screen revealed a narrow passageway. It wasn't a basement. It was a tunnel. Old, damp walls stretched into the shadows, disappearing into darkness. The air was colder here than in the gas station above, but not from the storm. It was the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones. David exhaled sharply. "I don't like this." "No kidding," Mark muttered, pushing himself up. His knees ached from the fall. His hands were filthy with dust and grime. Sasha swallowed hard, gripping Mark's sleeve. "Where does it go?" David turned, pressing his ear against the trap door. His body stiffened. "What?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David's face was pale. His lips trembled. "There's nothing," he whispered. "No movement. No voices. Nothing." Mark's stomach churned. Something was wrong. The clerk had been up there. The thing had been up there. They had been chased. The store had been filled with shadows, movement, terror. And now, it was empty. The gas station was silent, like it had never existed. A chill crawled up Mark's spine. He turned toward the tunnel. It was the only way forward. David inhaled sharply. "I swear to God, if we see bones down here." "Shut up," Sasha hissed. They moved forward slowly, step by step. The tunnel was narrow, forcing them to walk single file. The walls were rough, carved from rock, not built. Like this passage had existed long before the gas station was ever there. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Their breaths came in shaky puffs of white mist. Something about this place felt unnatural. Then, a sound. Soft. Faint. Footsteps. Not from behind them. Ahead. Mark stopped, raising a hand. Sasha and David froze behind him, eyes wide. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Then, a voice. You should not be here. Mark's blood turned to ice. The voice echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the walls. It wasn't angry. It wasn't human. It was layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Sasha's nails dug into Mark's arm. Turn around, she whispered. Mark, please, let's go back. David let out a sharp breath. And go where? We're trapped. The voice came again. Closer. You do not belong. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears. His legs screamed at him to move, to run, to do anything. Then his phone buzzed. BZZZT. A Snapchat notification. Mark's shaking hands lifted the screen. A photo, taken from behind them. It showed all three of them, but there was a fourth figure, standing right behind Sasha. Mark's voice cracked. Don't move. Sasha's breath hitched. Why? BZZZT. Another photo. The figure was closer. The tunnel was too narrow. They should have felt it. BZZZT. Another photo. Closer. Sasha's voice wavered. Mark. BZZZT. The final photo. The figure's face was directly beside hers. Its mouth was open. Mark spun around. There was nothing there. Sasha gasped, clutching her chest, eyes darting in every direction. David swore under his breath, pressing himself against the wall. Then, a sound. A breath. Mark's phone screen flickered. The battery indicator showed 1%. Then, darkness. The phone died, and from the shadows ahead, the voice whispered one last time. You are already mine. The darkness was absolute. Mark's phone was dead. The tunnel around them stretched into blackness, swallowing every trace of light. Even their breath felt heavy. Sasha whimpered beside him. David pressed his back against the tunnel wall, his chest rising and falling in sharp gasps. But Mark couldn't move. He could still hear the last whisper, curling around his ears like a cold breath. You are already mine. Something was here. They weren't alone. A faint sound echoed from deep in the tunnel. A shuffle, a drag, something moving closer. Then a soft click. A light, dim, flickering. It came from ahead, weak like an old lantern barely holding on to life. It swayed slightly as if someone or something was carrying it. Mark swallowed hard. This wasn't right. There shouldn't have been anyone down here. No one should have been carrying a light. But there it was. A warm glow, bobbing slightly in the darkness, growing closer. David gripped Mark's sleeve, whispering, We can't go that way. Mark licked his lips. Then where do we go? Silence. Sasha squeezed her eyes shut. Back to the trap door. David shook his head violently. We don't know if it's still there. Mark turned to look behind them, and felt his stomach drop. The way back was gone. Not blocked. Not collapsed. Gone. Where there had once been a passage leading back to the gas station, there was now nothing but solid rock. As if the tunnel had never been there to begin with. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. No, that's not possible. He pressed his hands against the stone, searching for a seam, a gap, anything. Nothing. Sasha started to hyperventilate. What do we do? David clenched his jaw. We move. Now. They turned back toward the light. It was closer now. Mark's stomach twisted. They had no choice. Step by step, they moved forward, their breathing shallow, their steps slow. The walls of the tunnel felt tighter, pressing in. The silence was unbearable. Then, a whisper. Not behind them. Not ahead. Above. Mark's eyes shot upward. There was nothing there. But he could feel it. The weight of something unseen, clinging to the ceiling, watching. Then Sasha screamed. Mark spun toward her. She was gone. David grabbed Mark's arm, yanking him backward. Sasha. The tunnel was empty. Mark's vision blurred. She had been right there. Right there. A sob echoed through the dark. Sasha's voice. Distant. Hollow. Mark. Mark's chest locked. Sasha. He ran. David cursed but followed. The light ahead flickered violently, as if sensing their fear, feeding on it. Then, they saw her. Standing at the end of the tunnel, facing away. Mark's body went cold. Something was wrong. Sasha didn't move. She didn't acknowledge them. She just stood there. Mark slowed. Sasha. No answer. David swallowed hard. That's not her. Mark's fingers twitched. It had to be. He took another step forward. Sasha twitched. A slow, unnatural movement, like a puppet with broken strings. Then, she turned. Mark's breath stopped. It wasn't Sasha. Not anymore. Her eyes were hollow, black voids that stretched too wide. Her mouth twitched in a slow, jerking grin, too wide for her face. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "Run!" The light exploded. Darkness swallowed them whole. A sound rushed toward them. Not footsteps. Something faster. Mark didn't hesitate. He ran. David was right beside him, their bodies slamming against the tunnel walls, blind, desperate, frantic. Behind them, something howled. Not wind. Not human. Something ancient. Something hungry. Then, a door. Mark barely registered it before David shoved him through. The world tilted. Then, silence. Mark gasped for air. The cold was gone. The tunnel was gone. He was lying on the ground, his face against smooth tile. The scent of cheap coffee and gasoline filled his nose. Slowly, he lifted his head. He was back. In the gas station. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The store was empty. No clerk. No customers. No sign that anything had ever happened. Then, a voice. "Mark." His breath hitched. He turned his head. David sat beside him, pale, shaken. "Alive." Mark exhaled sharply. "David." "Jesus." He grabbed his friend's arm, squeezing tight. "Real." Then his stomach dropped. "Where's Sasha?" David looked around, his face going pale. She was with us." "She." They both froze. Mark's phone buzzed. His hands shook as he lifted the screen. A Snapchat message. From an unknown user. Mark's fingers felt numb as he opened it. A photo. Of the gas station. But taken from outside. And in the distance, just at the edge of the snowy road, Sasha stood, staring at them. Her head tilted. Her grin, too wide. Then another message. Unknown user. "She's with us now." The lights flickered. The store door creaked. The storm outside screamed. And the last thing Mark saw was Sasha's shadow moving toward the door. The wind screamed. Lena's footsteps were barely visible in the knee-deep snow, already being swallowed by the relentless blizzard. The whiteout storm was all-encompassing, a swirling chaos of ice and wind that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. She was alone, or at least that's what she wanted to believe. Her breathing was sharp and uneven, every inhale burning her throat from the bitter cold. Where were the others? She had only lost sight of them for a second. A single second of disorientation, a gust of wind strong enough to knock her off balance. And then they were gone. She spun in circles, blinking against the snow, trying to make sense of the landscape. But it was all the same. Endless white. The cabin had been nearby. She was sure of it. They had mapped the trail, double-checked the distance. They had been so close. But now there was nothing. Just wind, snow, and the ever-growing sense that she was no longer alone. Lena pulled her coat tighter around herself, biting down on the panic rising in her chest. She needed to keep moving. Standing still meant freezing to death. She took a step forward, and then she saw them. Footprints, leading off into the storm. Her heart leapt. The others. They must have passed through here. Maybe she wasn't as lost as she thought. She followed them, quickly, desperately. But the more she walked, the more something felt wrong. The prints were too deep, too defined. The wind should have started to erase them by now. And worse, they weren't spaced like normal footsteps. They were perfectly even, like whoever had made them had been gliding. Lena stopped. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the storm howled around her. Something isn't right. She turned to look behind her, expecting to see her own footprints trailing back the way she came. But there was nothing. Her tracks were gone. Erased. As if she had never been there at all. A chill ran deeper than the cold itself, slithering through her bones. Then, the wind shifted, and from the corner of her vision, she saw it. A shape. Standing motionless in the storm. Lena's breath caught in her throat. It was distant, barely visible through the whiteout, but it was there. A tall figure, featureless, blending almost perfectly with the snow. Almost. She squinted, her mind racing. It's just a tree. Just an illusion. Then it moved. Lena staggered back, her heart hammering. The shape didn't lurch, didn't step, it just shifted. 1 second it was far away. The next, Closer. She stumbled, her boot catching on the uneven snow. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure didn't have a face. No defining features. Just a void where a person should be. Her pulse roared in her ears. The wind howled louder, and for a brief second, the storm parted just enough to reveal more of them, standing motionless, watching. A dozen, maybe more, their silhouettes barely visible through the blinding snow. Silent. Still. Then, in unison, they all took a step forward. Lena ran. Her legs burned as she pushed through the snow, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The cold bit into her skin, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The storm screamed around her, drowning out everything. But as she ran, as she fought against the blizzard, she heard it. A whisper. Soft. Distant. Right against her ear. You're going the wrong way. Lena's body seized in terror. The voice hadn't come from behind her. It had come from beside her. Right next to her ear. Too close. She spun wildly, eyes searching the endless white. But she was still alone. No figures. No footprints. Just snow. Then, a dark shape loomed ahead. A structure. The cabin. Lena nearly collapsed in relief. She had found it. She sprinted forward, ignoring the burn in her muscles. Safety. Shelter. She reached the door, her frozen fingers fumbling against the handle. It wouldn't turn. No, come on, she gasped, yanking at the door. It was locked. She banged her fist against the wood. Hello? Somebody help me. No answer. She turned, eyes darting back into the storm. The figures were gone, but something still felt wrong. Something was still watching. A soft creak echoed behind her. Lena stiffened. She turned back to the door. It was open. Just a crack. The darkness inside felt deeper than it should be. Like the space beyond the threshold wasn't just a cabin. Like it was something else. Lena swallowed hard. She didn't want to go in. But the storm outside whispered worse things. She took a step forward. Then, a voice. Soft. Inviting. From inside the cabin. Come in. It's warm. Lena hesitated at the threshold. The door was open. Just a sliver. The storm outside howled like a living thing, screaming through the trees, but inside the cabin, it was silent. Too silent. The voice still echoed in her head. Come in. It's warm. She swallowed hard, her breath coming in short bursts. No one had answered her knocks. No footsteps had rushed to greet her. No shadow moved beyond the open door. So who had spoken? She turned back toward the storm, her eyes scanning the swirling white, searching for any sign of the figures. But they were gone. The blizzard was relentless. If she didn't get inside soon, she'd freeze. She had no choice. Lena pushed the door open. It creaked, the sound stretching too long, as if the wood itself resisted. The warmth hit her instantly. A deep, heavy warmth. The kind that shouldn't exist in an abandoned cabin during a snowstorm. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. Lena spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She hadn't touched it. Her breath fogged the air as she stared at the wooden door, her hand hovering inches from the knob. Slowly, she reached for it, and stopped. There was no lock, no deadbolt, no chain, just an old-fashioned latch, slightly rusted, but completely intact. A gust of wind couldn't have done that. She took a shaky breath and turned back toward the room. The dim glow of an old lantern flickered from a small wooden table in the center of the cabin. Lena's stomach twisted. Someone had just been here. The lantern's flame wasn't flickering from lack of fuel. It was fresh, strong, alive. The rest of the cabin was sparse. A fireplace, unlit but filled with fresh wood. A threadbare couch. A small kitchen with rusted pots stacked in the sink. And across from the fireplace, a chair, facing the door. Lena's hands clenched into fists. Someone had been sitting there, watching the entrance, waiting, but the cabin was empty. Or so it seemed. She took a slow step forward. The wood beneath her boots groaned. Another step. The air felt thick, heavy. She reached out and touched the lantern. Warm. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making her jump. The storm outside had gotten worse, the wind howling with voices that weren't voices. She turned, her eyes darting toward the nearest window. She could barely see through the frost-covered glass, but she swore she saw movement in the snow. Something shifting. Then, a thump. Lena's breath caught in her throat. It had come from the other room. Slowly, she turned toward the hallway leading deeper into the cabin. The shadows stretched long, swallowing the space beyond the lantern's glow. Something was back there. Another thump. Closer this time. Lena's fingers itched to grab something, anything, to defend herself. Her eyes scanned the room, locking onto an old metal poker resting beside the fireplace. She snatched it up, gripping it tightly in both hands. Then she took a step forward. The hallway was darker than it should be. The walls seemed too close, the ceiling too low, as if the cabin itself was pressing inward. Another step. Her boots barely made a sound against the wooden floor. Another thump. She stopped just outside a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly open. The darkness inside was thick. Wrong. Lena's breath was shallow. She knew she shouldn't. Every instinct screamed at her to leave. But she needed to know. She reached out, fingers trembling, and pushed the door open. The room was small. A bed, a dusty dresser, a broken mirror hanging on the far wall. And on the floor, footprints, leading from the window to the closet. Lena's pulse pounded in her ears. The closet door was slightly ajar. Something moved inside. A slow, deliberate shift. Lena raised the poker, her grip so tight her knuckles ached. She had to see. She reached out and yanked the closet door open. Nothing. The closet was empty. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been inside. Just darkness. She exhaled sharply, her heart hammering. I imagined it. Then she noticed something else. The mirror. Her reflection was wrong. Lena's breath hitched. She stepped closer, her own face barely visible in the cracked glass. She lifted a hand. Her reflection did not. A slow, awful grin spread across its face. Then, it stepped out of the mirror. Lena's scream caught in her throat. Her reflection had stepped out of the mirror. The thing in front of her wore her face, but its smile stretched too wide, too forced. Its eyes shimmered unnaturally in the dim light, and its body glitched. Like it wasn't fully there. Lena staggered back, the poker in her hands trembling. Her mind refused to understand what she was seeing. The reflection, the thing that looked like her, tilted its head, watching her with an unsettling curiosity. Then it took a step forward. Lena choked on air. No, she whispered. This isn't real. The figure mimicked her movements, stepping closer, its arms shifting awkwardly like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Then, it spoke. It's warmer in here. Lena's body locked up. The voice was hers, but not quite right, layered like two voices speaking at once. The poker nearly slipped from her grip as her arms shook. Move. Run. Do something. But her legs felt like lead. The thing took another step, its feet not quite touching the floor. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the windows, making the old wooden walls groan under the pressure. Lena forced herself to speak, her throat dry. Who are you? The reflection's smile widened too wide. Then it answered. I'm you. Lena's pulse exploded. The reflection's head twitched, its expression flickering between amusement and something darker. Something hungry. Then it reached out. Lena ran. She bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled down the narrow hallway, nearly tripping over herself in her panic. Her body screamed at her to keep moving. She hit the main room, her fingers already reaching for the door handle. She yanked. It didn't budge. No, no, no. She twisted the latch, shoved her shoulder against the wood. Nothing. She spun around, eyes darting to the window. Frosted over. But something was outside. A figure. Tall. Still. Watching. Lena's breathing grew uneven. Her chest felt too tight. The figure in the snow didn't move. But as she stared, a horrible realization hit her like a freight train. It had her face. The same as the thing in the mirror. A perfect copy. Except, there was more than one. Dozens of them. Standing in the storm. All wearing her face. Her stomach twisted violently. This isn't real. This can't be real. Then, a sound behind her. A whisper. Close. Too close. You can't leave. Lena spun around just in time to see the bedroom door creaking open. And her reflection stood in the doorway. Except this time, there was no face. Just a smooth, empty void where her features should have been. Lena's vision blurred with terror. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in. The reflection took a slow step forward. Then another. Let me in. Lena's scream finally broke free. She grabbed the lantern off the table and threw it. Glass shattered. Fire erupted against the floor, flames licking at the wooden walls. The reflection didn't flinch. Lena lunged for the window, desperate. If the door wouldn't open, she'd take her chances in the storm. She grabbed the nearest chair, raised it over her head, and hurled it at the glass. The window didn't break. Her pulse stopped. Lena stared. The window was solid, unyielding, as if it was nothing more than a picture of the outside world, trapping her inside. Then, a soft tapping against the glass. Lena's breath came in short gasps as she turned slowly. The reflections outside were closer. Their hands pressed against the glass, their smiles widening in unison. Then they began to knock. Tap, tap, tap. Rhythmic. Steady. Lena's vision swam. The cabin was burning. Smoke coiled through the room, blackening the ceiling. The fire should have spread faster. But it didn't. It was like the flames were frozen in time, flickering but never consuming. Then, the whisper came again. Behind her. There's nowhere left to run. Lena turned. The reflection stood inches away, close enough that she could feel its breath against her skin. It lifted a hand and touched her cheek. Lena's vision fractured. The world around her warped, stretching and folding in on itself. The walls bent inward, the cabin groaning as if it were alive. Then, darkness. The last thing Lena heard was her own voice whispering, "It's warmer in here." Lena's body felt weightless. The moment the reflection's fingers touched her skin, her vision fractured. Reality bent, warped, collapsed. She couldn't see the cabin anymore. She couldn't see anything, just blackness stretching forever. Then, a sharp, blinding flash. Lena gasped, her lungs burning as if she'd just surfaced from drowning. Her body lurched forward, her hands hitting something cold and solid. Glass. Her breath fogged against the surface. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus. Where was she? The blizzard outside raged on. Snow whirled violently through the air, but she wasn't in the cabin anymore. She was outside. Lena's stomach twisted. No, that wasn't right. She pressed her hands against the glass, her pulse hammering. She could see the cabin through the window. The flames still flickered inside, frozen in time. The chair she had thrown still sat beside the unbroken glass. And then she saw herself, inside the cabin, standing where she had just been, smiling. Lena's knees buckled. No, no, no. She lifted a trembling hand and knocked on the window. Hey, let me in. Her reflection didn't move. It just watched. Lena pounded harder. Please. The thing inside the cabin, the thing wearing her face, tilted its head slowly, as if considering something. Then it lifted a hand and waved. Lena's blood turned to ice. She shook her head violently, stepping back from the glass. This isn't real. It couldn't be real. She was dreaming. She had to be. A sharp gust of wind cut through her jacket, reminding her that the cold was very, very real. Her lungs ached. The storm was getting worse. She had to move. But where? There was nothing but white. Then, a sound. A whisper. Lena spun around. In the distance, silhouettes. Tall. Still. Their featureless heads turned toward her, their bodies blending with the snow. More of them than before. Lena staggered backward, nearly slipping on the ice beneath her boots. She turned back toward the cabin. The window was gone. Her heart stopped. The entire cabin was gone. She stood alone in the storm, surrounded by an endless sea of white. Lena's breathing turned ragged. No, this isn't happening. Then, footsteps. Not hers. Slow, crunching footsteps. Coming closer. The figures in the snow began to move. Lena ran. Her legs burned with each step. The cold clawed at her throat. She didn't know where she was going. There was nowhere to go. But she ran anyway. The storm thickened, making it impossible to see. Her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. Not when she could still hear them. Whispers. Not words, but something deeper. Older. Then a shape appeared ahead. A structure. Another cabin? Lena's lungs nearly gave out in relief. Salvation. Shelter. She forced herself forward, her body on the brink of collapse. But as she drew closer, a sickening realization hit her. The cabin was identical to the one she had just left. Same size. Same windows. Same door standing slightly open. A gust of wind rattled it, making the wood creak like a voice calling her inside. Lena's knees nearly buckled. No, no, that's not possible. She turned, desperate to find another way. But the figures in the snow were closer. She could see them now. Hollow, empty eyes. Faces that were not faces. Waiting. Lena clenched her fists. She had no choice. She turned back to the cabin and stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind her. The fire flickered warmly in the hearth. The chair sat exactly where it had been before. And across the room, the mirror. Lena swallowed hard. It was whole again. No cracks. No distortions. And in the reflection, she saw herself, standing outside, smiling. Lena's hands shook. She stared at the mirror, unable to breathe. Her reflection wasn't just looking at her, it was outside, standing in the snow, smiling. Lena stumbled back, her boots scraping against the wooden floor. Her heart slammed against her ribs. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the reflection moved. It lifted a hand and pressed its palm against the glass. Lena's mouth went dry. No, 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 no. She turned away, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The cabin felt wrong now, like the walls were closing in, pressing against her lungs. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, but the heat felt hollow. She needed to leave. Now! She bolted toward the door, gripping the handle with frozen fingers. Locked. Her pulse roared in her ears. There was no lock. She twisted the knob frantically, shoving her shoulder against the wood. It didn't budge. A soft tap echoed through the cabin. Lena stiffened. She turned her head slowly, her body tense with dread. The mirror was fogging up, like someone was breathing against the glass. Another tap. Then a whisper. "Let me in." Lena's blood turned to ice. The reflection wasn't smiling anymore. Its head tilted. Its hands pressed harder against the glass, fingers twitching like they were testing the barrier. Then, a crack. A thin fracture splintered across the mirror. Lena's breath hitched. It was breaking. She backed away, eyes darting around the cabin, searching for anything, a weapon, an exit, a way out. The fire. Without thinking, she grabbed the poker from the hearth, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. The mirror cracked again. Lena swallowed hard. If it broke, if the thing inside got through, she couldn't let that happen. The reflection pressed its hands flat against the glass. It smiled. Then it stepped forward. The mirror shattered. Lena screamed. Glass exploded outward, shards raining down in glittering fragments. A wave of icy air blasted through the cabin, knocking her off balance. She hit the floor hard, gasping for breath, her vision swimming. The room spun around her, the air thick with frost and shadows. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Lena's stomach twisted as she lifted her head. The reflection stood in the wreckage of the broken mirror. Only, it wasn't a reflection anymore. It was real, and it was her. Identical. Every feature, every detail. But wrong. Its movements were too smooth, too deliberate. Its eyes, Lena's eyes, were empty. It took a step forward. Lena scrambled backward. "No," she choked. "Stay away." The thing stopped. Then, it laughed. A soft, unnatural sound that sent chills down her spine. It lifted a hand, mimicking her movement exactly. Then, in her own voice, it whispered, "You should have never looked." Lena's hands tightened around the fire poker. She had to fight. She had to. The lights flickered. The cabin shifted. The walls groaned, the ceiling bending inward, warping like melting wax. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Reality was breaking. The thing in front of her smiled wider. Its skin rippled. The storm outside roared, shaking the windows, rattling the floorboards beneath her knees. Then, the figure lunged. Lena swung the fire poker with all her strength. It passed straight through, like striking air. The thing didn't stop. It reached for her, fingers brushing against her shoulder. And Lena's vision went black. Lena's world collapsed into darkness. There was no sound, no cold, no warmth, just emptiness. Then, a heartbeat. Not hers. Slow, steady, distant. Lena gasped as her body jerked forward, her lungs filling with freezing air. She was lying on something hard. Wood. The scent of smoke and ice filled her nose. The cabin. She blinked rapidly, her vision swimming as she tried to regain focus. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting long, stretching shadows along the warped walls. But something was wrong. The cabin was too big. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, vanishing into the darkness. The walls, once close and comforting, now stood far apart, their corners lost in the void. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps. Where am I? She pushed herself up, her limbs sluggish, her head pounding. Then she saw it. The mirror. Whole again. Standing in the center of the room, waiting. Lena's stomach twisted violently. No, it shattered. She took a slow step back, her fingers curling into fists. The thing had come out of that mirror. Hadn't it? Her reflection stood inside the glass, staring at her. Expressionless. Lena's heart pounded. Her own face watched her, but something was off. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. And then, it smiled. Lena's blood turned to ice. The reflection raised its hand, pressing its palm against the inside of the glass. A crack splintered outward. Lena stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. No! Stay away! The reflection tilted its head, mocking. Then, it stepped forward. The mirror rippled like water. Lena ran. She bolted toward the door, but it wasn't there. The walls stretched endlessly in both directions, melting into shadow. The fire flickered weakly, swallowed by the vast emptiness around it. She was trapped. Let me out! Lena screamed, her voice swallowed by the suffocating silence. A whisper slithered against her ear. You never left. Lena spun around, her chest tight with panic. Her reflection was standing in front of her. Not in the mirror. Here, with her. Lena's body locked up in terror. It wasn't an exact copy. Not anymore. The skin was too pale. The eyes too hollow. The grin inhumanly wide. It took a step closer. Lena stumbled back, her knees threatening to give out. Stay away from me. The thing laughed. The sound didn't belong in this world. It lunged. Lena fell backward, hitting the floor hard. The room spun, the shadows shifting around her. The reflection's hands reached for her face, its fingers too long, too thin. Then, a sharp noise. A sound beneath them. A deep, guttural groan, like the earth itself was waking up. The reflection stopped. Its smile faltered. Lena's breath hitched. Then, the floor cracked. The wood beneath them split open, a jagged tear stretching across the cabin floor. A void, endless and hollow, yawned beneath them. The reflection's body twitched violently. Lena scrambled backward as the thing convulsed, its limbs twisting, its grin stretching into something monstrous. Then, it fell. The floor crumbled beneath it, and the reflection plummeted into the blackness. Lena didn't wait to see where it went. She ran, through the endless cabin, past the warped fireplace, past the mirror that no longer held a reflection. The shadows shifted. The walls groaned. The world was coming apart. Then, a door. Lena lunged for it, desperate. She threw it open and she was outside. The storm hit her like a wall, the wind tearing at her skin, the cold searing her lungs. She turned back. The cabin was gone. There was only the white void of the storm, stretching endlessly around her. And then, footsteps. Behind her. Slow. Deliberate. A whisper curled through the air, just beneath the wind. You never left. The wind screamed. Lena ran. Her body ached, her lungs burned, but she couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. The footprints behind her were being swallowed by the storm almost instantly, erased as if she had never been there at all. The cabin was gone. The mirror was gone. But the whispers remained, always just behind her, always just beyond reach. You never left. The words slithered into her ears, crawling under her skin, sinking into her bones. She choked on a sob, forcing herself forward. The storm grew thicker. Snow blinded her, the wind ripping through her coat, her gloves soaked through with ice. Her fingers felt like they didn't belong to her anymore, numb, foreign. She needed shelter. She needed something. Then, a shape appeared in the storm. Her pulse spiked. A structure? Another cabin? She sprinted toward it, desperation outweighing fear. As she drew closer, her stomach twisted. The cabin was identical to the one before. No, that wasn't possible. Lena stumbled to a stop, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned in a circle, searching the blinding white for any sign of another way out. Nothing, just the storm. And the whispers. The door of the cabin creaked open. Lena flinched. She stepped backward, shaking her head. She wasn't going back in there. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Lena. Her breath caught. She knew that voice. She turned, heart pounding. A figure was standing in the snow, barely visible through the storm. Lena. Her chest tightened. It was Jonah, her best friend, one of the people she had lost in the storm. His face was pale, lips cracked from the cold, but his eyes were clear. Real. Lena felt hope for the first time in what felt like forever. Jonah. She almost collapsed as she ran toward him, her body threatening to give out. He grabbed her arms, holding her up, his hands warm. Warm. That wasn't right. Jonah had been in the storm too. He should be frozen. A sliver of fear crept back into her chest. Was this real? Jonah looked down at her, his face twisting with concern. Lena, what happened? You're freezing. Lena opened her mouth, then hesitated. What was she supposed to say? That she had been trapped in a cabin that wasn't real? That her own reflection had stepped out of a mirror? That she had run through an endless storm, unable to escape? Would he believe her? Would she believe herself? Jonah touched her face gently. Come on, we have to get inside. Lena swallowed. Inside where? She turned her head slightly. The cabin door was still open. Waiting. Jonah, she whispered. Did you come from in there? His expression didn't change. His fingers tightened slightly on her arms. Lena, he said again, softer this time. We need to go inside. Her stomach turned. She took a small step back. Jonah's hands didn't let go. Jonah, her voice shook. You're. He smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a relieved one. A perfectly neutral, perfectly even smile. Like a mask. Lena's blood turned to ice. She wrenched her arms away, stumbling back. Jonah didn't move, didn't blink. The storm howled around them, but he stood perfectly still. Then, his head tilted. His lips parted, but the words that came out were wrong. Layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. You never left. Lena ran. Jonah's voice chased her through the storm, warped and broken. Lena, wait! Lena, stop! She refused to turn around. She knew what she would see. She ran blindly, her body screaming for her to stop, to rest, but she couldn't. Then, the storm thinned. The snow wasn't blinding anymore. The wind wasn't howling quite as loudly. And up ahead, lights. Real lights. Warm. Orange. Flickering. She sobbed, half laughing as she sprinted toward them. As she got closer, she saw the shape of a building. Not a cabin. A gas station. Her vision swam. She knew this place. She hit the door with her full weight, crashing inside, gasping for air. Warmth wrapped around her instantly. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly. The scent of coffee and old gasoline filled the air. She turned, her breath coming in sharp gasps, expecting. Nothing. The storm raged outside, but it was just a storm. No figures. No whispers. No Jonah. She let out a strangled sob, pressing her hands against her face. Jesus, you okay? She jumped at the voice. A clerk stood behind the counter, staring at her like she had grown a second head. You look like you saw a ghost. Lena almost laughed. She stumbled forward, gripping the counter for support. I got lost in the storm. I thought. She shook her head. Never mind. I need to warm up. The clerk nodded slowly, eyeing her coat, her wet boots. You're lucky you found this place. We don't get a lot of visitors out here. Lena exhaled, shaking from exhaustion, relief, confusion. She glanced around, half expecting something to be wrong. But everything was normal. Then, her phone buzzed. She flinched, her hands shaking as she pulled it from her pocket. A Snapchat notification. Her heart stopped. The sender, unknown user. Lena's stomach churned as she opened it. It was a photo of the gas station, taken from outside. And just beyond the glass door, a figure stood in the snow, waiting, its head tilted, smiling. Lena's hands trembled as she stared at her phone screen. A Snapchat message from an unknown user. The picture loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, but she already knew what it was before it fully appeared. The gas station, taken from outside. The blood in her veins turned to ice. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as she forced herself to look up. The large glass windows at the front of the gas station reflected only the fluorescent glow of the overhead lights. But the storm outside was too thick to see beyond the parking lot. She turned her phone around, showing the screen to the clerk. Did anyone else come in here before me? The man frowned. No, just you. Lena's fingers tightened around her phone. Are you sure? The clerk exhaled slowly, tossing his newspaper onto the counter. Look, kid, I know that storm's messing with your head, but trust me, nobody's been out there. BZZZT. Another Snapchat notification. A new video. Her fingers hovered over the screen, every nerve in her body screaming not to open it. She tapped it anyway. The footage started with a sharp burst of static. The camera was shaking, moving through the snow. It wasn't a recording of her inside the gas station. It was filmed from outside. Lena's breath hitched. The camera moved forward, creeping toward the large windows, the dim light from inside glowing softly against the glass. The angle shifted. The camera was watching her. Then, a shape moved past the frame. Something tall. Something wrong. The figure stopped just outside the reach of the gas station lights. The image was too grainy to make out a face, but Lena could see limbs that were too long, fingers that twitched unnaturally. Then, the figure grinned, and just before the video ended, the screen glitched, distorting the footage into eerie streaks of black and white. For a fraction of a second, just before the camera cut to darkness, the face became clear. It was hers. Lena's stomach twisted violently. She dropped the phone onto the counter like it had burned her, her entire body breaking out into a cold sweat. The clerk's brows furrowed. Hey, you okay? Sasha covered her mouth with both hands. That's not real, she whispered, shaking her head. It's some kind of glitch. BZZZT. Another photo, taken from inside the gas station. A photo of her, standing exactly where she was now. But there was a difference. There was a second Lena standing right behind her. Her stomach lurched. Her hands turned to ice. She couldn't move. The clerk let out a slow breath. Kid, there's nobody behind you. Lena turned her head slowly. Nothing. Just the empty gas station, the flickering fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. Then, the power cut out. The gas station was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the howl of the storm outside and the faint hum of the generator struggling to keep up. Then, a sound. Soft. Faint. Breathing. Right behind her. The gas station was silent. Except for the breathing. Lena stood frozen, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The darkness felt alive, pressing in around her, swallowing the last traces of warmth from the flickering power. The breathing was close. Right behind her. The clerk's voice wavered. Hello. No answer. Lena's fingers twitched toward her phone, its screen still dimly lit, the last received image frozen in place. A photo of her, with someone standing right behind her. She didn't want to turn around. She had to. Lena took a slow, shaky breath and twisted her head, her muscles stiff with terror. Nothing. The gas station was empty. But the breathing hadn't stopped. It was still there. Still right behind her. She just couldn't see it. Her stomach twisted violently. Run. Run now. The clerk fumbled beneath the counter, cursing under his breath. A second later, the emergency generator clicked on, the lights flickering back to life. Lena's body seized. The moment the lights returned, something moved. A shadow. Not cast by her. Not cast by anyone. It stretched across the floor, its shape wrong. Too tall. Too thin. Its fingers stretched into long, jagged claws, dragging across the tile. Lena couldn't breathe. The clerk noticed it, too. His face paled, his eyes widening in horror. What the hell? Then the lights flickered again. The shadow twitched. Lena's heart stopped. It was looking at her. Not with eyes. Not with a face. But she could feel it. Watching. The lights cut out. Total darkness. Lena's breath hitched. The air grew heavier, pressing against her skin like invisible hands. She could hear it. Something shifting. Something moving. Then, a voice. Low. Familiar. Lena. She choked on air. It was her own voice, echoing from the shadows. Lena, you should have stayed. Her legs moved on instinct. She ran. She crashed into a shelf, knocking over stacks of magazines, her hands blindly searching for the exit. The clerk was yelling, but the words didn't register. The only thing she heard was her own voice whispering from the dark. You never left. A blast of cold air hit her as she slammed into the door. It wouldn't open. The lock was frozen. Behind her, footsteps. Not running. Not stumbling. Gliding. The air grew thick, suffocating. The clerk grabbed her arm, dragging her back. The storeroom. Move! Lena's legs obeyed before her brain could catch up. They crashed through the storeroom door, the clerk slamming it shut behind them. The lock clicked. Silence. Lena's body shook. Her lungs burned. The air in here felt different. Not safe. Not better. Just different. She pressed her ear against the door, listening. No breathing. No footsteps. Then, a knock. Soft. Rhythmic. The exact pattern she had heard against the cabin's window. She slapped a hand over her mouth, her body trembling. Another knock. Then, from behind her, her phone buzzed. Lena's fingers shook as she lifted the screen. Another Snapchat message. Unknown user. Don't hide. She almost dropped the phone. BZZZT. Another message. Unknown user. Let me in. Lena's chest tightened. Then, a photo. Taken from inside the storeroom. From right where she was standing. The door behind her was open. The door was open. Lena's breath stopped. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. Her mind screamed at her not to look, not to move, not to breathe. The storeroom felt smaller now. The shelves loomed over her, the dim emergency light flickering weakly above. The clerk whispered, "Lena?" She shook her head, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles ached. No, don't speak. Don't move. Don't acknowledge it. A step. Soft. Not behind her. To her side. The light flickered again. Lena saw the shadow stretch across the floor. Not hers. Too tall. Too thin. The arms too long. The voice whispered. Her own voice. Lena. Her body locked up. Another step. Closer. The clerk moved first. He grabbed Lena's wrist and yanked her toward the back door. Move! She stumbled forward, her legs numb from terror. The shadow twitched, the figure shifting, gliding toward them. The clerk hit the door full force, shoving it open. Cold air rushed in. Lena ran. The storm hit her like a wall, the wind howling as she staggered forward, her boots slipping on the ice. She didn't stop. Neither did the footsteps behind her. Not running. Not chasing. Just following. She saw the outline of a truck near the edge of the gas station lot. The clerk's truck. Keys, she gasped, her voice barely audible over the storm. The clerk cursed, shoving his hands into his pockets as they reached the truck. His fingers shook violently as he fumbled with the key fob. The click of the unlocked doors was the best sound Lena had ever heard. They threw themselves inside. The doors slammed shut just as the lights flickered one last time. Lena turned toward the window. She saw it, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. A figure. Her. The smile was wider now. Too wide. The teeth wrong. Jagged. Inhuman. It lifted a hand. And waved. The truck roared to life. The clerk barely waited before slamming his foot onto the gas. The tires screeched, the vehicle fishtailing as they sped onto the icy road. The gas station disappeared into the whiteout almost instantly. Lena's heart didn't slow. Her hands were shaking as she stared at the side mirror, watching the snow swallow the road behind them. No movement. No shadows. No her. The storm began to thin. The wind died down. The snowfall became softer, lighter. But Lena knew. This wasn't over. The clerk exhaled sharply, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. What the hell was that? Lena didn't answer. She didn't know. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't want to look. She looked anyway. A Snapchat notification. Her hands trembled as she opened it. A photo of the truck, taken from outside, and in the reflection of the driver's side window. A face. Her face. Smiling. The cold was unbearable. Isaac pulled his scarf higher over his mouth, his breath turning to ice against the fabric. The wind screamed through the trees, rattling the branches like brittle bones. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. They should have reached the lodge by now. He turned to check on the others. Ellie trudged beside him, her head down, her hood pulled tight around her face. Behind them, Nate moved slower, one hand gripping his side. "This storm's getting worse," Ellie muttered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Isaac clenched his jaw. No, he wasn't sure at all. The trail had disappeared beneath the snowfall, leaving them wandering blind. His phone had no signal, and the GPS had stopped loading an hour ago. "Yeah," he lied. "We just need to keep moving." Ellie didn't argue. They had no choice. Nate groaned behind them. "I swear we've passed this tree before." Isaac didn't respond, because he had the same feeling. Everything looked the same now, just endless white, stretching in every direction. It was like the world had folded in on itself, trapping them in a loop. Then, a sound, faint, carried on the wind. Isaac stopped, his breath catching in his throat. A whisper. Soft. "Close." Ellie looked up. "Did you hear that?" Nate wiped the frost from his lashes. "What?" Isaac's fingers twitched. "I don't know. It sounded like..." The wind howled, drowning out the rest of his sentence. Another whisper. This time closer. Ellie grabbed Isaac's arm. "Someone's out there." Nate shook his head. "That's not possible. Who the hell would be out here in this?" Isaac turned slowly, scanning the tree line. His pulse stuttered. A figure stood just beyond the swirling snow. Tall. Still. Watching. His throat went dry. "Ellie, do you see that?" She followed his gaze. And froze. Nate frowned. "What? What are you?" Then he saw it too. The figure didn't move. Didn't shift in the wind. Just stood there. The storm thickened. For a moment, the figure vanished behind the snow. And when the wind cleared, it was closer. Ellie took a sharp step back. "No! No, no, no!" Isaac's body locked up. His breathing was shallow, his heart slamming against his ribs. That wasn't possible. He blinked. The figure was closer again. Nate stumbled backward. Okay, we need to go. Now!" Isaac grabbed Ellie's arm, yanking her toward him. "Run!" They didn't hesitate. The three of them bolted. The storm swallowed them instantly, the wind turning into a deafening roar. Snow lashed against Isaac's face, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Behind him, footsteps, crunching through the snow. Too fast. Isaac's lungs burned. His legs screamed. The trail was gone, but it didn't matter anymore. They had to keep running. Then Ellie screamed. Isaac skidded to a stop, spinning toward her. She was gone. Nate crashed into him, his face twisted in panic. Where is she? The wind swallowed his voice. Isaac's vision blurred. Ellie had been right there. Then, another whisper, right next to his ear. You're going the wrong way. Isaac whirled around. Nothing. Just snow. Just endless, endless white. Isaac's heart slammed against his ribs. Ellie had been right there, running beside him, her breath coming in short bursts, her boots crunching against the snow. And now, gone. Nate's hands gripped Isaac's jacket, his eyes wide with panic. Where the hell is she? Isaac turned wildly, scanning the whiteout. His breath came in sharp gasps, the freezing air burning his lungs. Ellie! The storm swallowed his voice. Nate grabbed his arm. We have to. A whisper. Low. Close. Behind them. Isaac's blood froze. He turned his head slowly and staggered backward. There, standing in the snow, was Ellie. But something was wrong. She wasn't shivering, wasn't panting. She stood perfectly still, her arms limp at her sides. Her face was pale, too pale. Her lips blue. And her eyes. They were wrong. Isaac took a slow step forward. Ellie. She didn't react. Didn't even blink. Then, a smile. Slow. Too wide. The muscles in Isaac's legs tensed, every fiber of his body screaming at him to run. Nate's breath came in short, ragged bursts. That's not. Ellie twitched. Not a normal movement. Not a shiver from the cold. A jerk. Like something inside her was adjusting. Then she took a step forward. Her boots didn't sink into the snow. Isaac's stomach twisted violently. His hands clenched into fists. Ellie. She laughed. Not her laugh. A copy. Flat. Empty. Like something had heard her laugh before and was trying to replicate it. Nate grabbed Isaac's sleeve, his voice trembling. We have to go. Now. Isaac took one step backward. Ellie took one step forward. A perfect mirror. Her eyes never left his. And in them, he saw something moving. Something inside her. Isaac turned and ran. Nate was right beside him, his breath ragged, his boots slipping against the ice. They tore through the snow, the storm screaming around them. Behind them, footsteps. Fast. Too fast. Isaac didn't dare look back. Didn't want to see. His body burned with exhaustion. His limbs ached. But he pushed forward, every nerve in his body screaming for him to run faster. Then, a light, flickering in the storm. A building. Isaac's chest tightened with hope. There, he gasped, barely able to form words. They sprinted toward it, snow crunching beneath them, their legs numb and shaking. It was a cabin. Isaac didn't think. He grabbed the door handle and threw it open. They collapsed inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The air inside was warm, too warm, like a fire had been burning for hours. Isaac and Nate gasped for breath, their bodies trembling. Then, a soft creak. Both of them looked up at the same time. The cabin had a mirror, hanging on the far wall, and in the reflection, Isaac saw Ellie, standing right behind them, smiling. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. Ellie stood in the mirror, but she wasn't behind them. Not really. His body refused to move. His lungs burned, every instinct in his mind screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something. Nate let out a choked noise beside him. That's not. Isaac swallowed. It's not real. Ellie's reflection smiled. Then, she stepped forward. Isaac grabbed Nate and yanked him away from the mirror. They stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, their feet slipping against the wooden floor. The reflection kept moving, coming closer. But Ellie wasn't in the room with them. Only her reflection was. Isaac's pulse pounded. He couldn't look away. The glass of the mirror rippled, like the surface of a frozen lake breaking apart. Ellie's figure twitched as it moved, her limbs bending at angles that weren't natural, her head tilting just a bit too far. Then she spoke. Her voice was wrong, like it had been recorded and played back at the wrong speed. "Why are you running?" Isaac's stomach turned. "You're not Ellie." The thing laughed. A horrible warped sound, like ice cracking. Then it took another step forward. And this time, it stepped out of the mirror. Isaac shoved Nate toward the door. The thing that looked like Ellie twitched violently as it touched the wooden floor, as if adjusting to this world, its movements jerky, unnatural. "Stay away from us," Isaac snapped, trying to keep his voice steady. His hands were shaking. He had never been this scared in his life. The thing stared at him. Then it took another step. Isaac ran. He grabbed the door handle and ripped it open, his entire body surging forward into the blizzard. Nate was right behind him, gasping, swearing under his breath. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know. Just run." The wind screamed around them, ice cutting into Isaac's skin like tiny blades. His boots crunched through the deep snow as he pushed forward, lungs burning, the cold threatening to suffocate him. Behind them, footsteps. Isaac didn't dare look back. He already knew what he'd see. The thing wearing Ellie's face. And it was getting closer. The wind screamed. Isaac's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he tore through the snow. His legs burned, his fingers were numb and useless, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Nate was beside him, his own breathing ragged. How is it moving so fast?" Isaac didn't answer. Didn't need to. The footsteps behind them were too steady. Too smooth. Not struggling against the deep snow like they were. Then a thought slammed into him like a punch to the gut. The thing wasn't leaving footprints. Isaac risked a glance over his shoulder. His stomach dropped. The thing that looked like Ellie was still behind them, its face frozen in that awful grin. But its feet weren't sinking into the snow. It was gliding, like the storm itself was carrying it forward. Isaac's heart seized. "Nate, don't look back." But it was too late. Nate did, and he screamed. Isaac grabbed him, yanking him forward. "Keep moving. We have to." Then he saw it. A building, barely visible through the whiteout, but real. "There!" Isaac shouted, half dragging Nate toward it. The cabin loomed ahead, its dark silhouette sharp against the blinding snow. The footsteps behind them didn't slow. Isaac reached the door first, nearly slamming into it. His numb fingers fumbled for the handle, praying it wasn't locked. It wasn't. He yanked it open and shoved Nate inside. Then, just before following, he looked back. The thing had stopped, standing just a few feet away. Too close. It didn't move, didn't react, just watched him. The wind howled between them, but it didn't touch the thing's hair, didn't ruffle its jacket. It was standing in the middle of a blizzard, and it was completely still. Then, it smiled wider. Isaac slammed the door. The cabin was silent, except for their breathing, ragged and uneven. Nate collapsed against the wall, shaking. What the hell was that? Isaac's hands trembled as he locked the door. Not that it would help, because he already knew. It would find a way inside. The wind screamed. Isaac's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he tore through the snow. His legs burned, his fingers were numb and useless, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Nate was beside him, his own breathing ragged. How is it moving so fast? Isaac didn't answer. Didn't need to. The footsteps behind them were too steady. Too smooth. Not struggling against the deep snow like they were. Then, a thought slammed into him like a punch to the gut. The thing wasn't leaving footprints. Isaac risked a glance over his shoulder. His stomach dropped. The thing that looked like Ellie was still behind them, its face frozen in that awful grin. But its feet weren't sinking into the snow. It was gliding, like the storm itself was carrying it forward. Isaac's heart seized. "Nate, don't look back." But it was too late. Nate did, and he screamed. Isaac grabbed him, yanking him forward. "Keep moving. We have to." Then he saw it. A building, barely visible through the whiteout, but real. "There!" Isaac shouted, half dragging Nate toward it. The cabin loomed ahead, its dark silhouette sharp against the blinding snow. The footsteps behind them didn't slow. Isaac reached the door first, nearly slamming into it. His numb fingers fumbled for the handle, praying it wasn't locked. It wasn't. He yanked it open and shoved Nate inside. Then, just before following, he looked back. The thing had stopped, standing just a few feet away. Too close. It didn't move, didn't react, just watched him. The wind howled between them, but it didn't touch the thing's hair, didn't ruffle its jacket. It was standing in the middle of a blizzard, and it was completely still. Then, it smiled wider. Isaac slammed the door. The cabin was silent, except for their breathing, ragged and uneven. Nate collapsed against the wall, shaking. What the hell was that? Isaac's hands trembled as he locked the door. Not that it would help, because he already knew. It would find a way inside. The cabin was too quiet. Isaac could still hear his own ragged breathing, the sound too loud in the small space. Nate sat against the far wall, his hands gripping his knees, his eyes darting between the door and the frost-covered windows. Outside, the wind screamed, rattling the wooden walls. But Isaac knew it wasn't the storm that was making the cabin creak. Something was out there, waiting. Nate's voice was hoarse. "You locked the door, right?" Isaac swallowed hard. "Yeah." It didn't feel like enough. He moved toward the nearest window, careful to keep his footsteps light. The glass was coated with ice, but through the frost, he could still make out the swirling snow outside. At first, he saw nothing, just white. Then, a shadow. Isaac's stomach turned. It stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the storm. The thing that had been chasing them. The thing that looked like Ellie. It wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, just watching. A fresh wave of terror crawled up Isaac's spine. He took a step back from the window, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then, it moved. Not like a person. Not like anything that should exist. 1 second, it was by the trees. The next, it was closer. Isaac's breath hitched. He staggered backward, crashing into the table behind him. The noise echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. The figure twitched. Then slowly, it lifted a hand and knocked. A single, deliberate tap against the glass. Isaac choked on air. No. Another knock. Then another. Slow. Rhythmic. Nate scrambled to his feet. Jesus Christ. The knocking didn't stop. It came from another window. Then the back door. Knock. 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 A pattern. Like it was waiting for them to open up. Nate let out a sharp breath. What the hell does it want? Isaac shook his head violently. He didn't want to know. The knocking grew louder, now coming from every wall. From the ceiling, a whisper slithered through the cabin. Soft. Close. Right against Isaac's ear. "You let me in before." His lungs collapsed. He spun around. The mirror on the wall was fogged. And through the haze, he saw a reflection. Not his. Ellie's. Her lips moved. But Isaac heard the words inside his head. "You never left." The lights flickered. Then, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. The silence was suffocating. The knocking had stopped. But Isaac knew it hadn't left. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, thick with something he couldn't explain. The wooden walls groaned under the weight of the storm, but Isaac had the sickening feeling that it wasn't the wind pressing against them. Nate stood frozen, his back pressed against the far wall, his breath uneven. Where did it go? Isaac didn't answer. He took a slow step toward the window, his fingers trembling as he wiped away the frost. His stomach lurched. The figure was still there, but it was closer, no longer standing by the trees. It was standing right outside the cabin. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. His pulse thundered in his ears. The thing hadn't walked. It had just moved, like reality had blinked, and it had simply appeared. Nate whispered, "What do we do?" Isaac didn't know. Then, the figure raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. A sharp, skeletal hand. Too long, too pale. Isaac took a step back. His whole body screamed at him to run, to move. But the thing outside tilted its head. And then, it grinned. The mouth was too wide, too sharp. Isaac choked on his own breath. His entire body felt like ice. Then it spoke, but not with its mouth. With Ellie's voice. Soft, familiar, but wrong. "Isaac." He flinched. "Open the door." Nate swore under his breath. "It's talking. Oh my God, it's talking." Isaac clamped a hand over Nate's mouth, his heart hammering. "Don't react. Don't answer it." The thing outside laughed. The sound made Isaac's stomach churn. It didn't belong in this world. It raised its other hand, and slowly, so slowly, it dragged a single fingernail down the glass. A piercing screech filled the cabin. Isaac's breath came in short gasps. "This isn't real. This isn't real." Then, it whispered again. "You let me in before." Isaac's hands clenched into fists. No, I didn't." The thing's head twitched. Its grin stretched wider. Then, it disappeared. The wind howled outside, the trees groaned in protest. But the figure was gone. Nate exhaled sharply. Where did it go?" Isaac took a slow step toward the window. This was wrong. It wouldn't just leave. Then, a sound. Soft. Close. A creak. Isaac's stomach plummeted. The sound hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside the cabin. Nate whispered, "Isaac, look." Isaac turned, and his blood ran cold. The mirror across the room was fogged over. And in the reflection, Ellie was standing behind them. Isaac's throat went dry. He turned his head slowly. Nothing was there. Just the empty cabin, the dim, flickering lantern casting trembling shadows across the walls. But in the mirror, Ellie was there, her eyes dark, her head tilted, her lips curved into a small, slow smile. Isaac's chest tightened. This isn't real." The reflection's mouth moved. But Isaac heard her voice in his head. "You never left." A loud bang. The door shook. Isaac jumped back. Another bang. Then, a knock. Slow. Rhythmic. Nate's breath came in short, sharp gasps. It knows we're here." Isaac took another step back, his heart slamming against his ribs. Then, from the mirror, Ellie's reflection laughed. And the knocking grew louder. The knocking grew louder. Isaac's pulse hammered against his ribs. The sound wasn't just coming from the door anymore. It was everywhere. The walls, the windows, the ceiling above them. A slow, rhythmic pounding, like a pulse pushing against reality itself. Nate pressed himself against the far wall, his breath ragged. "It's trying to get in." Isaac shook his head. No, it wasn't trying. It was already inside. The mirror. Isaac forced himself to look. The fogged glass was warping, shifting like something was pressing against the other side. Ellie's reflection stood there, her dark eyes locked onto his. Then, she took a step forward, but not into the room, inside the mirror. The space behind her stretched, twisted, like an endless void pulling itself open. The reflection of the cabin inside the glass was no longer a reflection. It was another place. Isaac's breath came in short, painful bursts. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The knocking stopped. Silence. The kind that pressed against your eardrums, heavy and unnatural. Then, the door swung open. Not violently. Not in a burst of force. It simply creaked open. A cold gust swept into the room, but the wind didn't make the flames in the lanterns flicker. The light stayed still. Nate whispered, "Isaac." Then he stopped. His face drained of color. Isaac turned toward the door, and his stomach dropped. Ellie stood in the doorway. But it wasn't Ellie. Her skin was too pale, her clothes untouched by the storm outside. Her boots left no footprints in the snow behind her. And when she smiled, Isaac felt something break inside of him. It was wrong. Too wide. Too sharp. The teeth, they weren't human. The thing that wore Ellie's face tilted its head, watching them with a cruel, unnatural curiosity. Waiting. Then it spoke, in Ellie's voice. But not quite right. Why are you hiding? Isaac grabbed Nate's arm, dragging him back. Stay away. Ellie, asterisk asterisk, or the thing pretending to be her, asterisk asterisk laughed softly. Then, the mirror cracked. A thin fracture splintered across the glass. Isaac flinched. The thing in the doorway stepped forward. The mirror cracked again, and this time, the crack spread across the walls, like reality itself was beginning to break. Nate gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Isaac didn't answer, because he knew they had nowhere left to run. The air felt wrong, heavy, suffocating, like something unseen was pressing against the walls, bending the space around them. Isaac's grip on Nate's arm tightened. Don't move. Nate was trembling. He wasn't even breathing right, his chest rising and falling too fast. What's happening? Isaac didn't have an answer, because nothing about this was real. The thing that wore Ellie's face was closer now, standing just inside the doorway. It didn't blink, didn't breathe, just watched them, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Then, the floor creaked. Isaac flinched, not because of the sound, but because the creak didn't come from the doorway. It came from behind them. A cold wave of terror washed over him. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head. The mirror. The cracks had spread, stretching out like veins, jagged and uneven. But that wasn't what made Isaac's stomach churn. It was the reflection. He and Nate were still standing there, but their reflections weren't. They had moved. Isaac's hands shook. He forced himself to step forward, heart slamming against his ribs. His reflection should have copied him. It didn't. The Isaac in the mirror stayed perfectly still. Then it smiled. Isaac's breath hitched. His entire body screamed at him to run. The mirror versions of himself and Nate stepped closer. But they weren't stepping toward the glass. They were stepping out. The cracked surface rippled like water. Isaac stumbled backward. No. The reflection of Nate's mouth moved. But Isaac heard the words inside his head. You shouldn't be here. The thing in the doorway moved at the same time. Reality fractured. Isaac's vision blurred, twisted. His head pounded with a deep, aching pressure, like something was trying to pull him under. The room warped. The walls stretched and bent, the cabin flickering in and out of focus. Then, the lights went out. Total darkness. Nate screamed. Isaac grabbed at the air, reaching for him, but his hands met nothing. The cabin was gone. And then, from the blackness, a whisper. You were never supposed to leave. The darkness was absolute. Isaac couldn't see, couldn't move, could barely even breathe. The whisper echoed all around him, curling through the air like smoke. You were never supposed to leave. A rush of icy air slammed into him, knocking him backward. His body felt weightless, as if he were falling through nothing. Then, his back hit solid ground. Isaac gasped, coughing as his senses snapped back. He was in the cabin, or at least, something that looked like the cabin. The walls were wrong. The wood looked stretched, warped, shifting like it wasn't actually solid. The lanterns on the walls flickered, their flames twisting into unnatural shapes. And the worst part, there was no door, no windows, just endless shifting wood. Isaac's pulse pounded. He scrambled to his feet, his body aching. Nate! No response. Nate! Silence. Isaac spun wildly, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Where was he? Then, a sound. Soft. A footstep. Isaac turned slowly. A shape stood at the far end of the warped cabin. It was Nate, or at least, something that looked like him. Isaac's chest tightened. Nate! The figure didn't move. Then slowly its head tilted. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. No, the thing wasn't breathing. Its mouth stretched open, too wide. Then, in Nate's voice, it whispered, You shouldn't have looked. Isaac's stomach turned violently. His feet stumbled backward. The thing took a step forward. Its movements were wrong. Not natural. Not human. The cabin groaned. The walls shifted, pulsing like a living thing. Isaac's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He turned, desperate for an escape. Then he saw it. A mirror. Standing at the other end of the room. And in the reflection, Isaac wasn't alone. There were more of them. Dozens of figures standing in the shadows, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted into empty smiles. Watching. Waiting. Then all at once, They stepped forward. The figures stepped forward. All at once. Isaac's breath hitched. His body screamed at him to move, but fear kept his feet rooted to the warped wooden floor. Their eyes were hollow, mouths stretched into unnatural grins. And yet, they all looked like him. A distorted army of Isaacs, each one standing just slightly out of sync, like flickering images from a broken screen. Behind him, the mirror warped, the glass bending inward as if it were about to shatter. The air pulsed. A deep, guttural sound rippled through the room. A heartbeat. Not his own. Isaac turned wildly, his pulse hammering. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Then, a whisper. Not behind him. Not ahead. But from inside his own head. You were never meant to leave. Isaac staggered backward. The reflection closest to him moved on its own. Its mouth opened, and this time, Isaac's voice came out. It's warmer here. The others repeated it, one by one, a chorus of his own voice, whispering in unison. It's warmer here. Isaac clamped his hands over his ears. Stop. The moment he spoke, the room collapsed. The wooden walls peeled away, dissolving into the storm. The ceiling warped, stretching into an endless void of white. And then, he was back. In the snow, his knees hit the ice-covered ground hard. His vision swam, the freezing air burning his throat. The storm was still raging, howling around him, but he was alone. No figures, no warped cabin, no reflections, just endless white. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, some kind of proof that this had happened, that he hadn't lost his mind. He clicked on the screen. One notification. A Snapchat message. From unknown user. Isaac's stomach dropped. His fingers hovered over the screen, every part of him screaming not to open it. But he did. It was a photo. Of him. Standing in the snow. His own face staring back at him. Except, he hadn't taken it. Then, his phone buzzed again. Another message. From unknown user. Come back inside. It's warm. The storm swallowed everything. Lena pulled her coat tighter around her, her fingers already numb inside her gloves. The wind screamed through the trees, the snowflakes thick and heavy, turning the world into a swirling blur of white. She glanced over her shoulder. Jonas was behind her, barely visible through the storm. His hood was up, his shoulders hunched against the cold. A few feet away, Milo trudged through the snow, his face set in a deep frown. We should have reached the cabin by now, Ethan muttered, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Kara didn't answer, because she wasn't sure they were even on the right trail anymore. The path had disappeared beneath the snowfall. Their footprints vanished within seconds of taking each step. No landmarks, no markers, just endless white. We need to turn back, Will said, stopping in his tracks. This isn't right. Ethan let out a sharp breath. And go where? We don't even know where back is. Kara's stomach twisted. He was right. They were lost. A gust of wind slammed into them, knocking Kara off balance. She stumbled, catching herself on a snow-covered branch. When she looked up, something had changed. The trees were wrong. They stretched taller than before, their trunks twisting into unnatural shapes. The branches, bare of snow, reached toward them like skeletal fingers. And worse, the trail was gone. Not covered, not buried beneath the snow. Just gone. Will spun in a slow circle. What the hell? Kara's pulse pounded. It was just here. Ethan turned toward her, his face pale. Guys, where are our footprints? Kara's breath hitched. They were gone. Not faded. Not buried. Erased. A sharp chill crawled up her spine. This doesn't make sense. Ethan pulled out his phone, his gloved hands fumbling with the screen. No signal. Will cursed under his breath. This isn't normal. The wind shifted. And then, a whisper. Soft. Distant. Kara froze. She turned slowly, her heart hammering. Did you hear that? Will and Ethan exchanged a glance. They had heard it too. Another whisper. Closer. Kara swallowed hard. The wind carried the sound, curling around them like breath against their ears. Their names. A voice. Familiar. Calling from somewhere in the storm. Then, a shadow. Just at the edge of their vision. Standing. waiting, watching. The shadow didn't move. Lena's breath came in short, shaky gasps as she stared into the swirling snow. It was just standing there, watching. "Milo," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the howling wind. "Do you see that?" Milo nodded slowly, his eyes locked onto the dark shape at the edge of their vision. Jonas, however, took a step forward, squinting against the snowfall. "Who is that?" he called out, his voice hoarse from the cold. The shadow didn't answer. Lena's stomach twisted. Something about the way it stood, too still, too unnatural, made every instinct in her body scream for her to run. Then, it was gone. Not like it had walked away. Not like it had been swallowed by the storm. Just gone. Jonas let out a sharp breath. "Did you see that? Tell me I'm not losing my mind." Milo shook his head. "I saw it too." Lena's fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack. "We need to keep moving." Jonas hesitated. "But which way?" "The trail." He didn't need to finish his sentence. The trail was still gone. A cold wave of panic slithered down Lena's spine. This wasn't right. Trails didn't just disappear. Footprints didn't just vanish. Another gust of wind slammed into them, nearly knocking Lena off balance. The blizzard was getting worse. The cold bit into her exposed skin, burning like needles. Then, the voice came again. Soft, distant, right at the edge of the wind. "Lena." Her blood ran cold. Jonas's head snapped toward her. "Did you hear that?" Lena couldn't speak, because she had heard it, and it had sounded like her own voice. The wind picked up, curling around them like invisible hands. Something was out there. Milo took a step closer, his face pale. "It said your name." Lena couldn't breathe. Another whisper. This time, from behind them. Jonas turned, his breath catching in his throat. "Oh my God!" Lena spun around. The shadow had returned. Closer this time. Too close. Its shape was clearer now, though the blizzard still blurred its edges. It was tall, unnaturally thin, featureless. And yet, Lena swore she saw something shifting beneath its surface. Like it wasn't solid. Like it was wearing something that didn't belong to it. A whisper slithered through the air. Not from the wind. "Come closer." Lena's body locked up. "No." Jonas grabbed her wrist. "Run." Milo was already moving, tearing through the snow. Lena didn't hesitate. They ran. Asterisk, asterisk. The wind screamed around them, the storm growing heavier, the snow blinding. Lena's lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She couldn't, because behind them, the footsteps followed. Too fast, too smooth, not struggling through the snow the way they were. Not human. Lena risked a glance over her shoulder, and regretted it instantly. The shadow was no longer standing still. It was chasing them. Lena's lungs burned as she ran, her legs aching from pushing through the knee-deep snow. The wind screamed around them, but the only sound that truly mattered were the footsteps behind them. Fast. Too fast. Jonas stumbled, nearly falling. Milo grabbed his arm, dragging him forward. "Don't stop. Keep running." Lena chanced a glance over her shoulder. The shadow was still there. But it wasn't running. It was gliding, moving without effort, without disturbing the snow beneath it. Lena's stomach twisted. It doesn't leave tracks. Her legs burned as she pushed forward. The storm was swallowing everything around them, making the world feel smaller, suffocating. Then, a shape appeared ahead. A cabin, half buried in the snow, its wooden frame barely visible against the storm. "There!" Jonas gasped. "Go!" They reached the door, Lena's frozen fingers fumbling with the handle. "Locked." "No, no, no," she whispered, slamming her shoulder against the wood. Milo grabbed a rusted shovel leaning against the wall and swung it at the doorknob. The metal cracked. The second hit knocked it loose. The door swung open. They fell inside. Jonas kicked the door shut behind them, collapsing against it. His breath came in ragged gasps. The cabin was dark. The only light came from the frost-covered windows, but they couldn't see outside, just swirling white. Lena pressed her hand against her chest, trying to calm her frantic heartbeat. "Did we?" Milo held up a hand. Listening. Silence. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of something listening back. Jonas swallowed hard. "Do you think?" Then, a knock. Soft. Rhythmic. From every window at once. Lena's breath caught in her throat. They turned, eyes wide, staring at the frosted glass. Shadows pressed against it. Tall. Still. Too many of them. Then, the whispers returned. Inside the cabin, the whispers slithered through the air like smoke, curling around Lena's ears, creeping into her thoughts. She clamped her hands over them. No. No, no, no. Jonas backed against the wall, his eyes darting between the windows. The shadows outside pressed closer, their outlines barely visible through the frost-covered glass. Then, a sharp creak. Not from the windows. From inside the cabin. Milo sucked in a sharp breath. We're not alone. Lena's stomach twisted. The air felt different now, like the walls themselves were breathing. The wooden beams groaned, stretching beneath an invisible weight. Jonas moved toward the fireplace, grabbing the rusted iron poker. His hands were shaking. Where is it? The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words. You don't belong here. Turn back. Come closer. Lena squeezed her eyes shut. The voices weren't coming from a single source, they were everywhere. The walls, the floor, the very air hummed with them. Then, the door rattled. Jonas spun, gripping the poker tighter. It's trying to get in. Milo's jaw clenched. No. Lena turned to him, her pulse pounding. What? Milo pointed to the floor. Isaac's blood turned to ice. Footprints. Inside the cabin. Leading from the door. To where they stood. Lena's body locked up. She hadn't heard it open. She hadn't heard anything. Then, a shadow flickered in the corner of her vision. Something moved. Between them, Jonas swung the poker. The air rippled. The lanterns flickered. The cabin seemed to breathe in. And then, everything went still. The whispers stopped. The door was closed. The windows were empty. And the footprints were gone. Milo exhaled shakily. Did it leave? Lena didn't answer, because something inside her knew the truth. It wasn't outside anymore. It was here. The silence was worse than the whispers. Lena's breath came in short, uneven gasps as she stared at the empty floor where the footprints had been. Gone. Erased. Jonas still clutched the fireplace poker, his knuckles white. Milo stood frozen, his gaze locked onto the cabin's walls like he was expecting them to move. The air inside felt wrong. Too still. Too expectant. Lena swallowed hard. It's still here. Jonas turned to her slowly. How do you know? The answer came before she could speak. A voice. Soft. Familiar. It came from the darkness at the back of the cabin, just beyond the glow of the dying firelight. Lena. Lena's chest locked up. The way it spoke. It was her voice. Milo took a step back. What the hell? Then it spoke again. Jonas. Jonas sucked in a sharp breath, his grip tightening around the poker. The voice repeated itself. Milo. Softer this time. Almost playful. Then, another set of footsteps. From behind them. Slow. Deliberate. Lena turned her head as little as possible, her body locked in terror. The shadows near the fireplace shifted. A figure stood there. Tall. Too tall. Its limbs were wrong, stretched, thin, unnatural. And its face. No, not a face. A hollow void where a face should be. Jonas exhaled shakily. It was outside. Milo swallowed. Not anymore. Lena's body trembled. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but where? The door. The windows? There was nowhere left to go. The thing took another step forward. And then, it smiled. Not with a mouth. Not with eyes. But Lena felt it smiling. And then it whispered. I know you. The lanterns flickered. The walls shrank inward. And the thing lurched toward them. The thing moved. Not like a person. Not like anything that belonged in this world. It jerked forward in sharp, unnatural motions, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The shadows stretched behind it, twisting and writhing, as if they were alive. Lena couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The cabin walls felt smaller now, pressing in, suffocating. The firelight flickered wildly, casting shifting shapes across the wooden planks. Jonas gripped the iron poker like it was his last lifeline. Milo's breath was coming in short gasps, his body pressed against the farthest wall. The thing watched them. It didn't have eyes, but it was watching. Then, it spoke. Lena's own voice crawled through the air, twisted and broken. You were never supposed to leave. Lena's stomach twisted violently. No, 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 no. Milo snapped. With a desperate, animalistic cry, he lunged forward, grabbing the rusted shovel from the floor and swinging it at the figure. It passed straight through, like swinging at smoke. Milo stumbled, crashing into the fireplace, his eyes wide with terror. Jonas swore under his breath. It's not real. But it was. It was standing right in front of them. And then, the lanterns shattered. Darkness rushed in. Lena gasped, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. The room was gone. The walls were gone. There was nothing. Nothing but the thing's whisper. Let me in. A sudden, crushing force slammed into Lena's chest. She hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Ice crept over her skin, a deep, unnatural cold seeping into her bones. She couldn't see, couldn't hear anything but that awful whisper. Let me in. Then, a hand wrapped around her wrist. Warm. Real. Jonas. Lena. Move. She gasped as her vision snapped back into focus. The cabin was still there. The fire still burned low in the hearth. But something was wrong. The walls weren't just closing in anymore. They were melting. The wood peeled away like rotting skin, revealing something underneath. Darkness. Not an empty room. Not a void. Something waiting beneath. Jonas yanked her to her feet. We have to get out, now. Milo was already at the door, but there was no door anymore. Just an opening. A yawning, black abyss where the exit had been. Lena's breath caught in her throat. They were trapped. Then, the thing laughed. It was everywhere now. In the walls, in the floor, in the air they breathed. There is no way out. The shadows swallowed the light. The shadows swallowed the light. Lena felt it seep into her skin, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her like invisible fingers. Milo was still pounding at the place where the door should have been. But there was nothing. Just that endless, yawning darkness, stretching beyond the walls of the cabin. If there even were walls anymore. Jonas gritted his teeth. This isn't real. It can't be. Lena wasn't so sure, because she could feel it watching. Something in the blackness. Something huge. Waiting. Then, a whisper. Right next to her ear. Turn around. Lena's breath hitched. She didn't want to. She knew what she would see. But she turned anyway. And there. It stood. Not in the darkness. Not in the walls. In the room with them. It was taller now. Impossible. Its limbs stretched and bent like something pretending to be human, but not understanding how bodies worked. And its face. There wasn't one. Just a blank, shifting void where its features should be. Like a reflection caught in glass, twisting and distorting. Milo's voice was barely a whisper. We're dead. The thing stepped forward. Lena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The air grew thick, pressing against her ribs, making it impossible to breathe. The shadows pulled toward the thing like gravity. Jonas grabbed Lena's wrist. There has to be a way out. Milo let out a weak, breathless laugh. We just tried the door. There is no way out. Then, a creak. Soft. Deliberate. From behind them, Jonas turned first. His face went pale. Lena followed his gaze. A door. Standing alone in the middle of the room. Not attached to a wall. Not leading anywhere. Just standing there. The handle gleamed in the flickering light. Lena didn't trust it. But behind them, the thing moved again. Closer. Jonas whispered. It's our only chance. Lena took a deep breath and opened the door. The darkness rushed forward. The darkness rushed forward. Lena fell. Not down. Through. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world bent, twisted, collapsed. She felt Jonas and Milo's hands slip from hers as she tumbled, weightless, spinning through an endless void. The shadows wrapped around her, thick and suffocating, pressing against her skin like they were trying to pull her apart. She tried to scream, but there was no sound here. Then, light. Blinding, searing light erupted from nowhere, slamming into her senses. The shadows snapped back. Lena hit the ground hard, the impact sending a sharp jolt of pain through her body. She gasped, her vision swimming, the world flickering back into focus. And then, she froze. She was in the cabin, but something was wrong. The walls were clean, untouched by decay. The fireplace crackled warmly, casting flickering golden light across the wooden floor. The storm outside was gone. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Like it had been reset. Jonas groaned beside her, rubbing his head. Milo was already on his feet, his face pale, his hands shaking. Where? Jonas swallowed. Where are we? Milo turned toward them slowly. His expression was unreadable. Then, he pointed to the mirror on the far wall. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Oh God, because the reflection staring back at them wasn't right. It was the cabin, but not the same one. The fireplace in the reflection was dark, the walls rotting, and in the mirror, the door behind them was open, but in reality it was shut. Lena's pulse roared in her ears. This isn't real. Jonas took a step forward, and his reflection didn't. Milo's breathing turned ragged. We're on the wrong side. Then, the reflection smiled. The reflection smiled. Not a normal smile. Not something human. Their mouths stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp. Lena took a step back, her entire body screaming that something was wrong. Jonas' breath came in shallow gasps. That's not us. Milo clenched his fists. Then what the hell is it? The figures inside the mirror tilted their heads. Perfectly synchronized. Perfectly wrong. Lena's stomach twisted. The warmth of the room, the light from the fireplace, it all felt fake. Like a trap. Then, Jonas moved, and his reflection didn't. Lena's throat went dry. They weren't mirrors anymore. They were something else. Milo whispered, "We need to get out of here." Lena nodded, stepping back toward the door. The reflections moved first. Not just moving, reacting. For every step they took backward, the figures inside the mirror stepped forward. Closer. Milo grabbed the door handle. Twisted it. Pulled. Locked. Lena's breath hitched. No, no, no. Jonas grabbed a chair, threw it at the mirror. The glass didn't break. Instead, it rippled. Like water. And then, the reflections stepped out. Jonas cursed, stumbling backward. Milo let out a strangled sound as his own reflection pulled itself through the glass, one leg at a time. Lena couldn't move. Her own reflection was standing in front of her now. Same face. Same clothes. Same fear. But the eyes. Empty. Lena's reflection whispered, "You took my place." The light inside the cabin flickered. Then the reflections lunged. The reflections lunged. Lena ducked, narrowly avoiding the twisted version of herself as it reached for her with two long fingers. Jonas swung the iron poker, smashing it into the closest reflection. It didn't stop. The thing staggered back, but the impact made no sound, no resistance. Like hitting air. Milo shoved the table toward them, knocking two of the figures aside, but they barely reacted. Lena's heartbeat pounded in her skull. "We need to get out." "There is no out," Milo shouted. "The door's gone." Jonas looked around frantically. He was right. The cabin was shifting, warping. The walls stretched taller, the ceiling bending inward like melting wax. The mirror was still there, still rippling, still open. Lena made a split-second decision. Through the mirror, Jonas's head snapped toward her. "Are you insane?" Milo didn't hesitate. Better than staying here. The reflections moved again, their hollow eyes locked onto them. No more waiting. No more playing. They attacked. Lena ran. The air thickened. The cabin groaned as if something inside it was waking up. Shadows pooled around her feet, trying to hold her back. She forced herself forward, her muscles burning, her lungs screaming for air. Then, she jumped. Straight into the mirror. The cold ripped through her. A sensation like falling through ice water, like being pulled apart piece by piece. And then, silence. Lena hit solid ground, the impact rattling her bones. She gasped, rolling onto her back, staring up at the sky. A real sky. Gray and stormy, but real. Snow fell lightly around her. The wind was soft, no longer screaming. She sat up, her pulse racing. She was outside. A clearing in the forest. The cabin was gone. Jonas groaned beside her, pushing himself up. Milo lay sprawled in the snow, breathing heavily. They were alive. It was over. Lena exhaled sharply, her body trembling. "We made it." Jonas nodded weakly. "We." Then he stopped. His face went pale. Lena's stomach dropped. "Jonas." He didn't speak, just lifted a shaking hand. Lena turned, and her breath left her. A cabin stood at the edge of the clearing. Not old, not rotting, brand new, its door slightly ajar. A single set of footprints leading up to it. Then, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A Snapchat notification. "Unknown user. Come inside." "It's warm."